imagine.
Yeah, I can't stand it. I just feel like I'm back at Woodstock. I don't know what the heck to do with my face.
Just let it sit there and you'll be in good shape.
Yeah, there you go.
Got it, sweetie.
Ladies and gentlemen. They introduced a royal baby just a little while ago over in London, and I think we've got our own royalty here today.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here for this very special WC Handy Music Festival event. My name is Terry Pace. I teach at UNA, and I have been writing about the Muscle Shoals music industry for a little over 30 years now. And I had the great honor and pleasure of knowing Jerry Wexler, and actually I was part of a group of people who, through the Alabama Music Hall of Fame, and through the Entertainment Industry Center, now the Entertainment Industry Department or Department of Entertainment Industry at UNA, and the Times Daily, brought Jerry here for his final visit to Muscle Shoals back in 1999, and that was a wonderful experience. And I also was present during the Etta James sessions, which were his last sessions here in the Shoals back in 1992, and I would give anything today for a phone call from Jerry Wexler, because those were always some of the most unforgettable experiences. And he passed away in 2008, and even though the last time I saw him in person was in 1999, I kept getting those phone calls till right up near the end. And he was an incredible man, and also an incredible music man. And he was not only the godfather of Muscle Shoals music, as he came to be known over the years, I think he was probably in the top 5 in terms of the most influential music people in American music in the 20th century. Not just in Muscle Shoals, but in America and all over the world. And you talk about someone who was responsible for milestones and landmarks in the careers of everyone from Ray Charles, Ruth Brown, Solomon Burke, on up to Dusty Springfield, Aretha Franklin, Wilson Pickett, and on and on and on. And Muscle Shoals kind of became his second home, but there really was a whole lot more to Jerry and his career before and after Muscle Shoals. But he kept coming back to Muscle Shoals, and he always did consider Muscle Shoals his second home. And I've gathered here today, and I am so grateful to each of them for their time and their talents and their memories today. Some of Jerry's best friends and closest collaborators, and I'm going to introduce them. To my left here, singer, songwriter, keyboardist, and the Alabama leaning man, the funkiest man on the planet, Mr. Donnie Fritts. I left out elegant, I certainly did. The elegant Alabama leaning man. The album that Chris Christopherson and Jerry Wexler produced on Donnie was called Prone to Lean, so don't you ever forget it. Down at the end there, we have 2 of Jerry's adopted children in many ways. We have 2 of the original Swampers. They were members of the Muscle Shoals Rhythm section who went out on their own and founded Muscle Shoals Sound Studios and were part of the Muscle Shoals Rhythm section. Went on, of course, to become studio owners, producers, a little bit of everything, true Renaissance men in terms of music. But we know them, of course, here. We call them 2 of the original Swampers, bassist David Hood and guitarist Jimmy Johnson. And a man who has become a legend in Muscle Shoals music, not only as one of the insiders in the recording studio, but a man who works behind the scenes so hard and so valiantly, so courageously and so tirelessly to put everything together. He's a photographer, he's an archivist, he's a writer, he's a historian, and he worked with Jerry Wexler very, very closely as a production assistant and in many, many other capacities. Abola Dick Cooper, Mr. Dick Cooper. And then the man in the middle knew Jerry Wexler better than all of us put together. And we are so honored and so proud to have him here in the Shoals for not only this event, but the event coming up Thursday night, which we'll tell you a little bit more about. But he has some stories to tell, I know, and he also has some tremendous insights into Jerry Wexler as both a man and a music man. So please welcome, give a very warm Muscle Shoals welcome to Jerry Wexler's son, Mr. Paul Wexler.
And but you know, my dad, nothing happened in black music for very long that my dad didn't pick up on and start to, you know, become incorporated in what he was doing in Atlantic. And now the movie Immaculate Funk, a great deal of it is about Muscle Shoals and how changing his way of making records from in the 50s where they would have charts and arrangers to coming down here and having head arrangements of these guys who were so good they could just come up with amazing stuff again and again and again without a chart. You know, that was a big turning point in my dad's life and in his career and in soul music, let's face it. But I also want to talk about some of the other turning points in my father's life that aren't emphasized as much in the movie. Now the first turning point I want to talk about is my father first got to Atlantic Records. And he had done other jobs in the business before, including famously at Billboard magazine, where he came up with the phrase rhythm and blues. Originally, the urban or black charts were known in the 30s and 40s under the term race records. And that began to sound very uncomfortable in the late 40s. And Paul Ackerman, the Billboard editor, said, we got to come up with something. My father said, well, how about rhythm and blues? And so he actually coined the phrase rhythm and blues back then. But when he was at Billboard, a lot of people, including Ahmet Ertegun, was the president of Atlantic Records, the founder of Atlantic Records, and my father's partner. They began to notice that when my father did a review on upcoming records that were coming out in the early 50s, the late 40s, a lot of the records he picked as the important ones, the ones to watch, were the ones that ended up being hits. And Ahmet was no fool. He noticed that. And this is one of the reasons he brought my father in. When my father got to Atlantic, he always says, well, Ahmet taught me what I know about producing. But when he got to Atlantic, he brought a couple of musicians with him. He brought Sam the Man Taylor and Mickey Guitar Baker, the two of the musicians who formed the core of the Atlantic rhythm section back in the 50s. And along with Connie Kay, who was the drummer later with the Modern Jazz Quartet, he actually started to change those records by bringing these musicians in as soon as he got there, you know. And, you know, I won't go too into it, but it was a one-man operation back in the 50s. He ran the sales department, hassling independent distributors around the country going, if you don't pay us for the last record, you ain't getting the next record, okay? And he hassled the radio stations, he worked publicity. I mean, he did the daily op in a way that's hard for us to imagine nowadays. I guess I also want to talk about that in the 50s, my father and Ahmet, after they got there, produced every record together. And, you know, Terry was talking about Ruth Brown and Ray Charles, the Drifters, Clyde McPhatter, the Chords, Chuck Willis, Big Joe Turner, Laverne Baker, and other artists. They produced those records together. And so they were very close in the 50s. I want to emphasize that they were like brothers, you know. Now, in 1962, another turning point in my dad's life is when he signed and started working with Solomon Burke. And Solomon Burke is one of the greatest soul artists of all times. And, you know, those early records, If You Need Me, Gotta Get You Off of My Mind, you know, Everybody Needs Somebody to Love. These are incredibly important records that influenced both R&B and rock and roll over in England. You know, I mean, the Rolling Stones did like 3 or 4 of these records in their early career. But the point I'm making is his work with Solomon Burke was his first solo flight as a producer, where he was actually not with Ahmet, and he really was just running this by his own lights and covering the spot himself. And it really was a big turning point in his life where he got his chops together to the point where he could come down here and work with these guys and really make it happen. I want to talk about one more turning point in my dad's life, then I'm going to shut up, because I don't want to go on too long. But in 1969, there was a disc jockey convention in Miami, and there was a lot of, I'm not sure how to put this, but there was a certain amount of feeling in the black community that they needed to run their own things, that they needed to run their own record companies, that they needed to run their own promo departments, and it's an understandable feeling. After a while, you do want to run your own thing. I do understand, and I've got no funny feelings about that. It's a natural development. But at this Black Disc Jockeys convention, there were some local gangsters who were going to shoot my old man. They actually were going to shoot him. And, but people got wind of it, and his friends, and people he worked with were all his friends, you know. That he really was tight with a lot of people in the community. gave him a warning, and he was hustled out the back door before anything happened. Now, I don't mention this because it's dramatic, even though it is. I mention it because this is a very sharp line, like the shadow line on Mercury, where on one side it's cold, the other side it's hot. Now, before this line, my father did almost, not exclusively, but 90% of the records he did were rhythm and blues records with African-American artists. After this line, he started working almost exclusively with Southern artists, with different white artists from around the country, and he started making a lot of swamp funk records down here with the Swampers. And I believe that that also is a very important turning point in his life. And I'm just trying to give you a little additional insight into my father that may not be in Immaculate Funk, which has a lot of great interviews, a lot of great footage of artists singing in it. So anyway, thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.
Speaking of the swamp funk, Jerry recorded a memorial greeting that was played at Sam Phillips's memorial service, in which he told a great story about trying to play the new Aretha Franklin record, which featured these two guys down on the end here, for Sam. And he made the mistake of playing Tony Joe White's The Train I'm On before he played the Aretha record. And Sam wouldn't let him get to the Aretha record because he kept playing The Train I'm On over and over and over again. And that Sam finally got in Jerry's face and said, "Jerry, that sounds so good it don't sound paid for."
Well, you mentioned that my dad was one of the important guys. I put Sam Phillips right in there as well, without a doubt. He was, as important as they get.
Definitely, definitely. And if you'll look, we have a lot of great photos, a tremendous number of photos from Dick Cooper's collection. Dick knew Jerry a lot longer than I did, but I brought just a few that are out there. And there's one, the closing panel for the music symposium that we did there in 1999 was called The Men Who Made the Music. And it was Jerry Wexler, Sam Phillips, Rick Hall, and Buddy Killen. And that was an evening to remember. That was a 2.5-hour evening to remember with these legendary guys who really were the men who made the music and who had such a profound effect not only on Muscle Shoals, but on the rest of the world as well. I want to, I pulled some quotes from some interviews that I did with Jerry over the years, and to get some talking points started here. And David Hood and Jimmy Johnson in particular, I want you to respond to this quote. Jerry's talking about when he first came down to Muscle Shoals. And he says, rigor mortis had set in up north. And Paul alluded to this. He says, rigor mortis had set in up north. I had spent a decade recording with written arrangements. Now, a written arrangement is one person's idea of how a song should be played. Well, those arrangers were out of licks, and we were out of our minds. I was reinvigorated by this southern method of recording. This revolutionary method of him stitching a record together on the floor of the studio. Once I had a taste of that, I loved it. Muscle Shoals was like a religious retreat. So what happened when Jerry Wexler arrived in Muscle Shoals and you guys gave him this epiphany, from your perspective?
You brought Wilson Pickett. Prattville. And Wilson had been he started out with the Falcons up in New York area. And when he come down here, Pickett was a little shaky about it because the plane landed in a cotton field. And that's definitely, Pickett didn't want to see no cotton. But Jerry came in, and I think that one of the first things that totally blew us away was after the first song, Land of a Thousand Dances.
Yeah.
After the song was cut, he walks up in front of Roger's drum kit and says something to Roger had never heard before. And he said, "Roger Hawkins, you are a great drummer." And I have to tell you, that just totally blew us all away because, I mean, you'd have to hear Jerry talk. And somehow, through all those years, we all tried to imitate him. So you know what's coming next. And Jerry used to really have a big time watching us imitate him on panels. I remember the first time that I got a call at home from Jerry Wexler. Back then, the houses had one phone on the wall between the bedrooms. And I remember I answered the phone and I could hardly talk when I heard his voice. He said, "Jimmy, how you doing, baby?" And I'm telling you, I froze. And I was almost like the guy that grew up in New York said, and he said, "Jimmy, you want to come to New York and play on a King Curtis album?" Yes. Yes. And what he was doing, he wanted us to come up, but his real reason for us to come up was to, after we got through with King Curtis's album, the night before we were going to go back, he got us all in a circle, and it just me and Spooner and Roger and Cogbill and Chips Moman. And he said, "Guys, the Aretha record is taking off. Both sides, two-sided hit." And he said, "We only have two sides." And he said, "We need to finish the album. Will you guys stay up and just stay over and we'll finish the album?" I mean, nobody said no. And that was during the time that we cut Respect and all that stuff. And I mean, it was just quite a period in New York. This was at Atlantic Studios with Tom Dowd on the board. And we had Arif Mardin was helping on the arrangements on the floor with Tommy and assisting Jerry. And I tell you, I know David has too. We can think back, and I don't think we'll ever see times like that again. Do you?
No, sir.
And our people like that. I mean, we had already been cutting some hits with Jerry, but that whole experience, I tell you, it was like how he became to the four of us. It was like not trying to scrounge in on you.
No.
He was like a second father. And we stayed best of friends until he died.
That first single that Jimmy's talking about was "I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You" on the A side, and then "Do Right Woman, Do Right Man" on the B side, which of course began here, and then they moved to New York and finished everything up there. And then kept working with Aretha up there for several years.
Yes, Spooner's intro is the first thing you hear on that first Aretha record.
And David, let me ask you, to following up on that, this quote I read, Jerry talks about how Muscle Shoals changed him and changed his musical perspective. How did he change Muscle Shoals and change you guys as musicians?
We started with Rick Hall and Quinn Ivey, and great record people, both of them. But Jerry was the first really big worldwide record producer. I mean, all of a sudden we were taken to a different level working with somebody like Jerry. I think Jerry is the closest I've ever come to working with a genius, I'm sure of that. and his associates were like that as well. Tom Dowd and Reeve Martin and the rest of the great guys at Atlantic Records. Wexler had a great team, and but he took us to another level. All of a sudden we saw a different, even though it wasn't bad in Muscle Shoals with Rick and Quinn, we started to see more of a worldwide, global situation in the record business. And he treated us pretty well too. Scared us to death.
Now, Donnie,
I remember one story. Go ahead.
go ahead, Jim.
He came up to me on that picket session, and we were totally petrified that we couldn't play, or I couldn't play maybe what he would ask me to play, and then I'd be fired. I mean, it was like, and he come up to me one day, and then he said the words, "Jimmy, can you give me a little giggy giggy gongy gongy?" And I said to myself, what the hell is giggy giggy gongy gongy? I didn't know. I said, what is this? I mean, some foreign language I do not know. But of course I didn't say it out loud. But I was so shook up, I didn't know what to do. I had a lick that I had come up with, and I started playing. I said, Jerry, what do you think about this? And thank the Lord in heaven, he said, gee, Jimmy, that's great. So I played the lick and stayed on the session, you know. But I mean, you know, I just knew I was gone.
But you're still here. Now, Donnie Fritts, I want to ask you, now, you know, one of the, I think Rolling Stone named it, it and the Aretha, the first Aretha album were right up at the top there. Both produced by Jerry Wexler in terms of the greatest albums by female singers of all time. One was Aretha, and the other was Dusty Springfield's Dusty in Memphis, which was originally supposed to be Dusty and Muscle Shoals, which you can talk about this. But talk about the recording of Breakfast in Bed, and then how Jerry ended up co-producing with Chris Christopherson your first solo album.
Okay, yeah, as far as Dusty in Memphis, like I say, it was supposed to have been cut here, but the guys, I think, had a prior engagement, and so they moved it to Chip's Moment Studio in Memphis. And Jerry had already talked to me, and he talked to Eddie Hinton about writing a song for him. And now they'd gone through at least 1,000 songs with Dusty, and she was tough, man. You know, she was hard to please, which she should have been. But anyway, we had the song Breakfast in Bed that we wrote just for her, and it was like a song that we'd never written before. It was more of a uptown, more pop sounding song, and most of the stuff we'd written before that was just funk or R&B stuff. And so anyway, we got the song written, and she loved it, and they recorded it, and it's been a blessing to me to have been part of that record. I was there when they cut the tracks, and I think Dusty was extremely intimidated with what was going on, so he couldn't get her to sing for putting the tracks down. But anyway, they got everything done, and Jerry, I will say this, one time we were talking, and just about a lot of the stuff that he had produced, and I said, well, what is your favorite record? If you had to come up with one. And he said, you know, that's so hard to do because of Aretha, Ray, and Solomon and all these people. But he said, if somebody, in his colorful way of putting it, he said, if somebody put a gun to my head and said, give me one name, go, Dusty in Memphis would have been in it. So that made me really
And she finished the vocals in New York City. That was
yeah,
where
she did the
finished
vocals up there, yeah. But anyway, as far as my first solo album, that was just something that came about with Jerry and I talked. We talked continually on the phone. we had really bonded at the Muscle Shoals Sound when during one of their sessions, but we bonded not so much over the music as our love of books and reading, and we both loved Southern writers. We had a huge love for the great Southern writers. And so one night I just finished a book, and I said, Jerry, I got a great book for you. He said, what is it? It's the song. I said, it's a book called The Gospel Singer by Harry Cruz. You know that book, man.
Oh, yeah.
He said, I bought it 2 nights ago and just finished it. He said, it's one of my favorite books of all time. So we really bonded over that. And after that, we continually sent each other books. And this happened up till his death. Not too long before, you know, when we were still writing to each other. And he had sent me some books, and I love Jerry Wexler. He was like a father to all, a godfather to us. And I would always, you know, I loved him. From that, we were talking, and somehow I got talking about me doing an album, and so I wanted him to work with Chris. I mean, he really loved Chris. He had met Chris one night. We were playing a club in New York, and so he came over, and from that night, by the way, he met Chris. He met John Prine and signed him 2 days later. John come by the club that night, and I was sitting with Jerry when Chris got John up to sing, and he said, "Who in the hell is this kid?" You know. Naturally, I said, "Well, I'll introduce y'all when the show's over." Jerry signed him about 2 days later. But anyway, I wanted Chris to be involved in the album, so and he was all for that. We came down and did the album here, and it was a lot of fun. I got to use the guys here, which was a treat, and it's one of the great experiences of my life to say I was on Atlantic Records.
Yeah.
It doesn't get any better than that.
Another reason that he got his own album, he had pitched a song to Brooke Benton called Rainy Night in Georgia that his friend Tony Joe White had written.
Yeah, exactly. I gave
it was a monster record.
You know when it was too, when you guys were, this is a strange little story. I was in Memphis without a car and without a way to get home. I'd been there with Tony Joe for about 2 weeks. We were doing his second album, where I was just with him. And so I saw Jerry at the hotel we all used to stay out there, the Holiday Inn. And so he said, "Well, when are you going home?" I said, "Well, whenever I can get a ride." He said, "I got a car. I'm going to Muscle Shoals. And I got some people I want you to meet." I said, "Who?" He said, "I'll tell you when I get in the car. I don't want you going around talking about it." So it's when you guys were doing the Stones. It's when they were here. So I rode back to Muscle Shoals with Jerry. And was there just for a few minutes when they were there. I didn't stay long, but it was a big experience there. But the next morning is when I gave him, he said, "You got anything for Brooke Benton?" I said, "Well, I'm sure I do," but I said, "I know I've got something." They had given me a 7.5-inch copy. Tony Joe gave me a copy of his album. He just finished this thing 2 days before this. And so I said, "There's about 3 songs on here you should listen to for Brooke." And he cut all 3 of them. One of them happened to be Rainy Night in Georgia. So that was a good deal for Tony.
You know, Dick Cooper has so many photos, and I'll let Dick tell you about the collection and what all you can see and where you can see it. But Dick photographed a lot of these milestone sessions, including, I was watching, and it's on YouTube, and I think Paul put it up. There's the Grammy Living History interviews.
Yes,
It's
sir.
3 or 4 parts, and it's fascinating. Interview with Jerry that records so much wonderful
It's a
stuff.
2-hour interview where he talks a lot about his early life and collecting jazz records, and being a huge Bing Crosby fan,
That's right.
which was the first artist he
That's
actually
right.
fell in love with.
And he said at that point, he said, I can still recite you every lyric from every Bing Crosby song. But he says on those interviews that if you held a gun to his head, the three geniuses he would say he worked with were Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and Bob Dylan. And Dick, I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about what happened when Bob Dylan came to town and what your memories are of that session or other sessions that stand out in your mind with Jerry Wexler.
Well, to be honest, the first session that Bob came to town on was Barry Goldberg. He co-produced with Jerry on that album, and it was the first time I had been around Bob. And Jerry wanted me to get pictures, and we did a group shot outside, and Bob wouldn't come out. And Jerry's like, I don't care what you got to do, I want some pictures of Bob in the studio. So there was a vocal booth in the corner, and there was a window that you could see out into where the main part of the studio was, and then the control room across the way. And there was a tack piano pushed up against the wall there. So I snuck in the vocal booth, and I got a stool, and I got up on top of the stool with the light out so I could shoot over the top of the piano at Bob and Jerry out on the floor. And I got some really crappy photographs. But they were pictures, and so Jerry was delighted, and loved it. And then in '79, or I guess it's '78, when he brought Bob in for the Slow Train Coming album, that was the first time I'd actually spent any time with Bob. And he was a very enigmatic kind of guy. He was really gracious. I thought he didn't know my name, because he wouldn't call you over and say, come over here, I want you to do something. He would get up and he would walk over to you and say, would you please do so-and-so? And he never spoke my name. I thought he didn't know it. And Jerry was, just being Jerry, but Bob was really uptight because that particular Slow Train Coming album was the first gospel record that he had made. And so he was in Jerry, because Jerry, being the consummate atheist, he was a devout Jewish atheist, is the way he put it. But he would work with Bob, whatever Bob wanted to work on, that didn't bother him at all. But they were having these real intense discussions in the back of the control room. And you can see in some of these photos, Bob's hunched over and he's like scribbling notes, and Jerry's just, he's giving him chapter and verse to go look up, and to question his conversion. But all that being said, Barry's up front with Greg and Mark Knopfler, and they're just churning out these great tracks that fit perfectly with what Bob was doing. And then he came back the second time for the Saved album, and he was much more relaxed. He was, really a lot more secure in the fact that he had made this conversion. And so it was all fun and games again. But the Slow Train Coming album was pretty intense. I mean, nobody slacked up at all.
He said in an interview with me something similar, but in his book, he said when I got called by Dylan, he said, I jumped at the chance, and he said, and then I found out what the album was, and what the content was. He said, which was fine with me, because I would produce Dylan reading the phone book. He said, but I couldn't get over the irony of Dylan calling me the wandering atheist Jew to get the Jesus feel. Well, Dick, can you tell us a little bit about what you have on display here, and then other places like Thursday, what they can see Thursday from your collection?
Basically, I was around Jerry on 12 albums. I started out with a Gary Farr album, which was, I think, 72 or 3. That's when I first met him. And at that time, I was working for the Times Daily as a reporter, and I did a weekly music gossip column. And somehow Jerry decided we were friends. And here again, I think as much like he was saying, we were both bookaholics. And so we got to where we would talk about books a lot. And I was at one point editing the paper, and I had to be in at 5:30 in the morning, but I got off at noon. And Jerry would call me and ask me if I'd go have breakfast with him. Well, my lunch was his breakfast, and so we got the meeting at Carl's Restaurant out in Muscle Shoals on the corner of 72 and Woodward, and that's really where our friendship started. And but we go have breakfast and talk about books.
You love him.
And he loved Carl's smoked ham.
Along with that kind of Dylan paradox there, Jerry called me on Christmas Eve one year when I was still at the newspaper, and I was just about to get out for the day, and he asked me to send him a copy of something that I had written. And on the phone, right before I told him goodbye, I said, "Oh, and happy holidays." And he went, "You can wish me a Merry Ecumenical Christmas." Paul, exactly.
You know, he was always talking about being an atheist, right? In the end, when Jerry got sick and closer to the end, I'd be calling him and I'd always say, "Jerry, I'm going to be praying for you." And almost every time I'd ever say that, he'd straighten me out. But this time he didn't.
Amen.
He said, "Jimmy, go ahead." I thought we have made some room here.
He did change his shtick in the last 5 years of his life. He used to say, "All prayers and blessings are gratefully accepted." And that was the phrase that he used.
Oh, well. You know, we hear about, and Tom Brokaw made this phrase, you know, part of our lexicon, I guess, the greatest generation. And, you know, we look at our military heroes and our leaders and from that era, but I think that the cultural leaders and the cultural pioneers, the cultural innovators are often left out of that. And guys like Sam Phillips and Jerry Wexler. And one of the things that to me, stood out to me about Jerry was that he kept pushing me. He really would push me as a writer and as a reader, and to expand my horizons musically. He would send me books, and by golly, you better read them, because he'd be calling you, asking you questions and quizzing you about them. Exactly, he would. And Paul, I just wanted to make this observation and to get your perspective on this. To me, he was an educated man who was also a continuously self-educated man. He kept educating himself.
No. He never stopped. There was always something for interest. You know, one way or another, he was reading all the time and always discovering new authors, and always having like lots of hardcover books that just at the end of the day, you know, they just kept piling up because he would never stop. And he was always looking for something new musically to catch his eye, you know. He always wanted to hear some new thing that was, and I remember when I turned him on to the Cuban piano player, Chucho Valdez, who's a tremendous player, and he was like, it was the one thing that I actually brought to him that he had never heard of, that he completely fell for, you know, and I've always feel a little bit proud of that fact, you know. He managed to get something that wasn't on his radar already, you know.
And he was open-minded musically too.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
I mean, just continually. He didn't stay kind of locked into what he did.
I'd say that he embraced so much of what was American popular music from the 20s, you know, right up to the 70s, you know.
I would like to say
Western swing, yeah.
A big fan of Bob Wills.
what Jerry did for Muscle Shoals. Well, we know Rick Hall is basically the guy that gave us all a chance, and he hired us. And he was, in a way, kind of the father of Muscle Shoals music. But the way you can really describe Jerry is, he was the great-grandfather of Muscle Shoals music, because he turned the international light on us. I mean, where I guess we had hit records in America in the first part, in Canada, but once we started working with Jerry, it was all over the world.
And I guess I just also want to say that, you know, I always felt that if Otis Redding had lived, that he was on the edge of the crossover success that Michael Jackson achieved about 8 years later. And that this ability of artists to cross over and to actually breach cross the breach between the races in America and actually bring people together on the basis of a shared love of music. I believe that's a big factor in our country being a better place than it used to be. I really do believe that.
And with that, I know that we're running out of time. I want to read a couple more of these quotations, and then I want to ask one general question for everyone to respond to. But you mentioned the Aretha session, and Jerry told me once, he said, listen to Aretha's first single that we recorded down in Muscle Shoals, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. Astonishingly, she was the only black person in that room, yet there never was a funkier record made. That defies every theory of racial purity in the book. And then he was talking about, really, Aretha had been recording for Columbia and had not had a hit, and they were recording her doing, light jazz and pop. They were actually recording her doing things like There's No Business Like Show Business. And what a waste of talent there. Leave that to Ethel Merman. But he said his instincts when they signed her to Atlantic, he said, I knew Aretha was the daughter of the Reverend C.L. Franklin, the radio evangelist, so she had deep gospel down in her soul. Even though she grew up in Detroit, she was born in Memphis and had been baptized early on in both the blues and the music of the black church. So I knew that the secret of recording Aretha, of capturing her essence as an artist, was to take her down south and to take her back to church. The sanctuary I chose was Fame Recording Studios in Muscle Shoals. So in the interviews I did over the years, he kept coming back to that kind of religious retreat, kind of metaphorical language there with Muscle Shoals. And then he also told me, he said, there I was living up in New York and having all these sophisticated friends and all of these people who were involved in, who were intellectuals and who were involved in the arts and culture. And he said, over time, I got a kick out of going back home and telling them I had friends down south who had voted for George Wallace. And so, he told me, he said, that was a lesson to him in not judging anything until you experience it, and to keep your mind open, to keep your horizons open. But I do want to start with David down on the end. From your perspective, what is, from Muscle Shoals and beyond, what do you think is Jerry Wexler's legacy?
Oh my gosh. It's tremendous. I know he gave me my first chance in bigger things than what I'd been doing. When I played on the Aretha session, I'd been playing the bass guitar 5 years. 5 years. No, that's not very much. But my first session with Jerry, I was playing the trombone. I think the only reason I got on that session was because they couldn't get the horn section they wanted. And it was the horn section that kind of created the stir that had him leave Muscle Shoals. But he was willing to give me a chance, even as inexperienced I was. And so that's the big thing for me.
Jimmy?
Legacy. Jerry, to me, was the most powerful man I'd ever listened to talk. He had his vocabulary was so big. I used to bring a dictionary to the hotel with me to see what the hell he said. And I had never been interested in vocabulary. But he was so impressive, and besides that, he was fair. I remember when he came down to Muscle Shoals, and me and Roger was playing at the Land on the weekend, and he wanted to keep going. So me and Roger went up to Jerry and said, Jerry, I hate to tell you this, but we got a gig. And he said, oh, no problem. You guys play it. And I thought Rick was going to kill us because he didn't want to lose any time working with Jerry and all that. But he took off so we could go to the Line and play it at that time, it was Eddie's place. I remember Moss Eddie. But I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. I mean, he worried about what we thought. And because that was still a time that was providing enough living for us to stay in the business, and he had the heart.
Wonderful. Mr. Wexler.
I mean, I already talked a lot about what I think my father's cultural legacy is. I guess I just keep coming back to my same thought, which I am an extraordinarily lucky person to be who I am, to have been exposed to his intelligence, his way of thinking about not just music, but the world and literature, like everyone is saying. And I said this at my dad's memorial, but I'd still mean it, that I would not change a lick of what happened when I was growing up between me and my father. I wouldn't even change a note, because I am very pleased to be who I am, and I give all the credit to my father and my mother, you know, for how I came out and how I am, and I'm very pleased.
I think the thing that impressed me most about Jerry was he was such a people person. Here he was, one of the most powerful men in the record company, or the record world, and yet he had time for anyone who really had a sincere interest. I picked him up at the airport in Huntsville one time, and while I was getting his bags, he decided to get a shoe shine, and there was a fellow there shining shoes and a smock, and they got into a conversation about music in general. I came back when I had got the luggage. He finished the shoe shine. We left. That was on a weekend. About Tuesday, we went to the Southland to have dinner. And as we're going into the restaurant, this guy's coming out in a suit. And Jerry just starts talking with him. And the guy looks at him kind of like, who are you? But then he realized, and they'd had this conversation that just sprung up. And it took me 5 or 10 minutes to realize, this is a guy that was shining shoes in Huntsville, 75 miles away 2 days ago. And Jerry remembered who he was, just remembered his face, and they jumped right back into this conversation. And that was just kind of amazing to me that he had that level of recognition and remembrance of individuals. I wish I had it.
Donnie?
Well, we could talk all day about his all his accomplishments, he was a tough guy.
No doubt.
You know, he was Atlantic's tough guy in a very tough business. But he was one of the best people I've ever known in my life. I would like to say one little story about two of the most important people in my life is Chris Christopherson, who Jerry come to love very much. And Jerry, it's tough. But anyway, when Jerry was died, Chris, he flew to Sarasota, where Jerry was living, and Jerry was on his deathbed. And Chris flew from Hawaii to Sarasota and spent an afternoon just singing.
I was there, yes, sir.
Yeah, singing all his songs. And Jerry couldn't hear him, but I said, did he ever make any kind of recognition? He said, well, on one song, he kind of gave me a little sign. And I said, which one was it? He said, if I look like a mean old man, that's who I am. I said, that's perfect. So that says it all right there. Thank y'all.
Thank you all for your time and attention. We've got the film coming up here, which is 72 minutes. It's a short, sweet film in which you'll see several of these folks, as well as Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and Jerry Wexler himself. And we're looking forward to sharing that with you. I do want to give you I'm a teacher, so I'm going to give you 3 little pieces of homework here. If you have not read it, you need to read Jerry's autobiography, Rhythm and the Blues. And I have my copy back there, and Paul tells me it's available as an ebook now.
It's available through Random House as an ebook, and that's just something that they approached me, and I got together with my father's co-author. I said, you know, we really it's good to have it out there, and if it's just out there as an ebook, it's still something that people are interested they can get to, and it's very much worth reading, in my opinion. It's probably one of the best music business biographies ever written. So.
And we were talking about Jerry's vocabulary when we were doing the Men Who Made the Music panel. Buddy Killen was kidding Jerry about not understanding half of what he was saying because his vocabulary was so. He said, Jerry knows every word in the English language and they are all in his book. And another thing I wanted to advise you of is the concert that we are doing. And I saw Jimmy Nutt was here. He may have slipped out. Jimmy Nutt, the president of the Muscle Shoals Music Association. We are doing a concert Thursday night at 7 o'clock, I believe, over at the Marriott. Tickets are still available as part of the Muscle Shoals to Music Row series. And many of these folks will be available and will be there performing, including Paul, who's going to perform Thursday night. And it is Christine Ullman. And it is $10 each, Jimmy, is that correct?
Yeah.
$10 each, is that correct? And tickets are going fast.
And
So
it's mostly the decoys backing her up, so you know it's going to be fantastic.
yeah, it's going to be great with guest appearances.
8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock. I'm sorry.
It starts today, but the doors open at 7, okay? But Spooner's going to be there, and Bonnie Bramlett and her daughter Becca, both tremendous artists.
Steve Bassett.
And Steve's coming down. He is fantastic on that B3 and singing. He's a great artist.
It's going to be a great celebration of Jerry's life and his music and his legacy.
And Donnie's on
And of
stage.
course, Donnie.
Donnie's on stage. I'm sorry.
That's right.
And I am going to be there.
And one last thing, I hope this is still up, but Paul and his sister put together a beautiful memorial service for Jerry, and I was unable to be there because of circumstances I could not control. But the memorial has been on YouTube, and I hope it's still there.
It's on YouTube. It will be on the YouTube channel, so to speak, is called Wax 2, okay? And there's interviews with Bob Porter, a tremendous expert on R&B on that channel, the 2-hour video interview with my dad that Terry mentioned, and also the memorial, which was a 3-camera shoot, high definition,
Beautiful.
And it was the Muscle Shoals guys meets the King Curtis Rhythm section in New York. It really was a fantastic time. A lot of great artists, William Bell and Betty LaVette and Alan Toussaint, and really a tremendous, and And Joe South. Joe South did one of his last live appearances, and it really rocked the house. You know, he was great. And so I just say that, and also it moves along. It's not something that drags. It's a piece of entertainment as well as a memorial. So, and it's the thing I'm probably proudest of that I've ever done, along with my sister Lisa. So.
It is beautiful, and I highly recommend it.
So it's Wax 2 on YouTube.
And once again, thanks to David Hood, Jimmy Johnson, Dick Cooper, Donnie Fritts, and our special guest, Paul Wexler. Thank you all for being here.